This week's Dark Side of the Ring tackled the story of Chris Adams, the gentleman and the demon. Almost like the tale of two people. You had some people saying he was a great guy, other people saying that he was a terrible human being. One minute he could be charming, the next he could be a monster. He puts the dark in Dark Side of the Ring for sure. His daughter said that he didn't want his demons, but they got him anyway, and that he was a great person who's not here to defend himself, and so she wants to do that for him because she loved her father. Which is understandable. That doesn't necessarily make him a great person, though. He was a 20-year veteran, won 26 championships throughout his career, but may be best known for being the man who trained a young Steve Austin, who did not think very highly of him. In his book, he called Adams a pile of crap, and he once said after Adams died, "I didn't comment when Chris died, and the Dallas Morning News called me. I wasn't going to run him down in the paper because the guy was dead, but I didn't think a whole lot of him." You know, it's funny that Chris Adams trained Steve Austin when Adams himself never had any formal pro wrestling training. He relied on his background in judo. I know his brother was a judo champion, I think a silver medalist. And so when he broke into the wrestling business, that's really what he relied on. And he is credited with inventing the super kick, which is really just a judo thrust kick, but he threw in the leg slap so that it would make a sound, which everybody does now to the point where it doesn't mean anything. But he used it as his signature move. He was the guy who used the super kick. And they interviewed Kevin Von Erich, Iceman King Parsons, and David Manning for this, all of whom worked with Chris in World Class Championship Wrestling, which is where he won the majority of the titles in his career. Beyond his son and his daughter, they also got his brother for this episode, Neil, and his ex-girlfriend, Jeannie Clark, who played Lady Blossom when she managed Steve Austin in WCW. The two of them were also married for a while, Austin and Jeannie, and she was the one who told Austin one day after the office had given him all those terrible names to choose from. Right? Fang McFrost, and Ice Dagger, and he's sitting at home one day thinking, man, because he doesn't want to be the ringmaster anymore. So he's trying to come up with names. And it was Jeannie who said to him famously, "Drink your tea before it gets stone cold." And that's where Stone Cold came from. But Adams met her at a bar. He hit on her at a bar when she was 19, and she thought that he looked like Paul McCartney. And within a month, they were living together, and he had the idea to make her his valet on TV. And they had a daughter together, but the relationship fell apart after he cheated on her. So they were still cordial. She just didn't want to have a romantic relationship with him anymore, but she was still active, with him on TV. They said Chris had a reputation for being very Jekyll and Hyde, kind of like the angel and the devil. He could switch between the two very quickly, especially once he got some alcohol in him. Kevin Von Erich said that a lot of wrestlers used to be bullies. And case in point, one day their driver made them late for a show. So Chris did a very rational thing. He reached over into the driver's seat and began choking the man, nearly to death. And there are plenty of stories like this. And then there's this, a little more lighthearted, but just as crazy. Bruce Pritchard told this story on his podcast years ago. It was the first time he ever met Chris Adams. Chris was fresh out of jail, he said, which was a common occurrence. And the two of them were out one night. They were looking for a place to drink. They were in Little Rock, Arkansas, which at the time was a dry town. So it was no easy feat to find a place to drink. So they were having a problem getting into a club, and they got recognized by two couples who got them in. And so they're drinking and they're partying, and they end up going back to one of the couples had a double-wide trailer. So they all go back to the trailer. And then out comes the drugs. After a while, Bruce noticed that Chris was missing and one of the wives was missing. And he goes and he finds them in one of the back rooms having sex. The husband went to go find his wife, and when he did, he must have thought that she left or something. When he did, the two of them, Bruce and Chris, they got the hell out of there. He said that was the first time and the last time that he ever hung out with Chris Adams. But that story is downright tame compared to some of these other ones. In World Class, Adams got paired up with Gino Hernandez. They did an angle where, Adams had been a babyface, kind of like the kind English gentleman, very over with the women there, as the Von Erichs were. They did an angle where he turned on Kevin Von Erich, and then he and Gino became a heel tag team, and they found a lot of success. And then Gino was found dead at the age of 28 of a cocaine overdose, although not everybody believes that story. Remember, Gino got his own Dark Side episode, one of the previous seasons. I covered it at the time. There were a lot of, people thinking, well, it was, he was a victim of a hit, and there's all kinds of crazy conspiracies about what happened to Gino Hernandez. But after Gino died, Chris's alcohol and his drug problems, they spiraled even more out of control. I mean, they were bad enough. They got even worse. And they told a very short version of what has been dubbed the Israel incident. This was actually covered in the Tales from the Territories episode on World Class. World Class, for whatever reason, was very popular on TV in Israel. They loved the Von Erichs. And on one trip over there, Chris Adams beat up a bartender, they claimed, by super kicking him and knocking the man's eye out. Yes, another eyeball story. Even if one of these stories was ever proven to be true, there's no way that they all are, so I just assume that they're all full of shit. This man gouged a guy's eye out with his bare hands, and then this guy super kicked someone's eyeball out of their skull. Brutus Beefcake was walking down the hallway in the hospital with Hulk Hogan when he blinked and his fucking eye fell out of his head. Like, imagine this man super kicking someone so hard that their eye falls out. That would be the greatest finish of all time. Except today, the other guy would kick out at 2. And then he would lose to a roll-up or something. Anyway, so now they have to get him the hell out of the country before the cops pick him up. So David Manning rushes him to the airport in a disguise, and he makes it onto the plane. Manning gets back to his hotel, and the cops are there waiting for him to ask him about Chris Adams. But he just played dumb and said, I have no idea where he is. Now, from the Israeli incident, there was the plane ride from hell. Not the WWE plane ride from hell. This predated that one. He had a return flight from Puerto Rico. It got grounded for hours. There was some kind of mechanical issue. So to keep the passengers happy, the airline offered them an open bar, which Chris Adams was more than happy to partake in. Once they were up in the air, they cut him off. They said no more alcohol. And that's where things went south. He unloaded on the flight attendant, called her a bitch, among other things that I won't repeat. That brought out the co-pilot from the cockpit to try to calm him down, and he ended up grabbing the pilot by his collar and headbutting him 3 times before he was finally subdued. Now, I found some old UPI wire stories about the case, and he could have been charged with a felony. That would have carried up to 20 years in prison. Instead, he was convicted of a misdemeanor assault, and he faced up to 6 months in jail. He wound up serving half that. He served 90 days behind bars. Then there was another story. They didn't tell it here, but there was another story where they were in the Middle East somewhere, and he broke a hotel clerk's orbital bone by stomping on his face over not being able to use the phone. And I don't know if he was drunk or not. That may have just been him getting angry. But again, I understand sticking up for your dad because he's your dad, and you think he's a great guy. But there are just too many stories like this that say otherwise, as far as what kind of person this guy was. After the plane incident and his time behind bars, he gets talked into starting his own wrestling school. For a guy, again, who had no formal wrestling training himself, it's kind of funny how now he's going to start his own wrestling school. And his first student, who saw the infomercials that he was cutting on TV advertising it was Steve Austin, or Steve Williams. He would become Steve Austin. And we got some early Austin footage. They ended up working a feud together in Dallas that got pretty heated. As far as, Jeannie being involved, and I think Chris's, his new wife or girlfriend, she was involved too, so they would have cat fights. So it got a lot of heat. And they started, by starting that angle together, it led to Austin and Jeannie getting together off camera in real life. The daughter in the episode thought that it was wild to think that her mom, her dad, her stepdad, and her stepmom all worked a program together. And when she said that, I realized, I guess that would make Steve Austin her stepdad. But after a while, Austin felt like he was being held back. Adams felt like, hey, this kid's about to outshine me and become bigger than me, which he eventually did. And that apparently ate him up inside, that he wound up being remembered more for training Steve Austin than for his own wrestling career. But there was another incident where Adams was in the back seat with his young son. His wife was at the wheel. They got into an argument, and it nearly caused an accident with an 18-wheeler. Chris beat this woman so badly that she needed to have surgery on her face. Now, the son in the episode says that he was a little bit older when his mom showed him the photos of what he had done to her, and he was stunned that his father would be capable of that. But that was enough for her to finally leave him. Chris eventually got a shot with WCW in 1997. This was when they were the #1 wrestling company in the world. But they just used him as an enhancement talent. I don't know why he would have thought they would have used him any other way. I mean, he had no chance of being pushed at a serious level. I mean, I think he would have fit right in with Lord Steven Regal and Dave Taylor, but they apparently didn't want to work with him. Or at least Regal didn't. There was some kind of heat there. Regal didn't want to work with him. He actually wrestled Macho Man. Little interesting trivia note. Chris Adams wrestled Macho Man Randy Savage in the very first match on the very first episode of WCW Thunder. That might be his big claim to fame during that period of time in WCW. But there were stories of him promoting events and then bailing with the money and not paying people. Jim Ross once called him a con man and said that he abused women, had a bad temper, and he was generally not a very good person. Chris got heavily into the drug GHB. And that ended up leading to tragedy. Chris was staying with a man named Boo Ray at the time, who was interviewed for the episode. I swear to God, go take a look at this guy and tell me he does not look like George Mizanin. I swear, I was like, the Miz's dad killed Chris Adams? My mind is blown. But I swear to you, go take a look at this guy and his hair and everything in the episode and tell me he does not bear a resemblance to George Mizanin. So Chris needed a place to stay. He had no money at the time. And so he stayed with Boo Ray, whose real name is Brent. And he got along with Chris. He considered him a friend. They actually became very good friends. He allowed him to live in his home. He was also Chris's driver, so Chris could get around while he was all messed up, and so he wouldn't be a danger on the road to other people. He used this man. I mean, that's basically what it was. You know, Chris very clearly used this man. Probably saw him as an easy mark, took advantage of the man's generosity. Then he ends up falling in love with a woman named Linda. And they were only dating for a few weeks. He brings Linda home one night. And so Boo Ray heads to bed. He didn't want, to have anything to do with whatever they were going to be doing. But he says in the episode, he had warned Chris before, I don't want that GHB stuff in this house. Anything else you want to do, I don't care. It's your business, but no GHB. So Boo Ray goes to bed. This was maybe 2:30 in the morning. A few hours later, it's 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning. Boo Ray gets up. He said, well, it must have been how eerily quiet it was that woke him up, I guess. But he gets up, he walks in, and he finds them both passed out. Chris was slumped over a chair. Linda is on the floor on her back. The way he described it is her lungs started wheezing. So what does Boo Ray do? Does Boo Ray call 911? Nope. Boo Ray calls their friend to ask what he should do because he's afraid that if he calls the cops, Chris is going to be pissed. And the friend at least had enough common sense to say, they're not breathing. Call the fucking cops. Now, Linda ended up dying from an overdose of alcohol and GHB. And Chris would talk about it and say, oh, it's such an unfortunate thing, and it was just a total accident. And then, there were other people who say that it was him, that he's the one to blame, and, he probably gave it to her, and again, we'll never know for sure. Obviously, both were complicit if they were both doing things they shouldn't have been doing. I'm sure he was not a great influence on her. Let's just put it that way. Now, the following year, Adams was indicted on a manslaughter charge and was for her death, and was still awaiting trial at the time of his own death, which came in October of 2001. Boo Ray had been the best man at Chris's wedding. This was only a month before this happened. Right? Like I said, they were very good friends. Chris and Boo-Ray one night are hanging out at Boo-Ray's mother's house, and they're drinking. And he doesn't know what set Chris off, but he got real angry all of a sudden. The demon came out. He may have asked him, keep it down, my mom is trying to sleep, whatever it was. He just flew into a rage. Now, Boo-Ray said he had a 4-post bed. Chris broke one of the posts off and swung at him with it. Then he put Boo-Ray in a sleeper hole, pushed him onto the bed. He started gouging his eyes. He bit Boo-Ray on the face and the neck. And now he starts choking him. And Boo-Ray thought he was going to die. So he reaches over. He kept the .38 caliber handgun on his end table. Reaches over, grabs the gun. He puts the gun to Chris's shoulder, and he pulls the trigger. And when he did, I guess the way Chris moved, this is according to Boo-Ray now, the way he moved or whatever, he ended up shooting him in the heart, and he killed him. Now, they showed some of the crime scene photos of the gun on the end table, and they even had a shot of Chris, his body, just, he was laying there dead in bed. You can't see his face. He's laying ass up, but there he is. And they said the funeral for him was packed. Boo-Ray was eventually found to have acted in self-defense, so he wasn't charged with anything. He's a free man today. And even though, look, we weren't there, so we can never know for sure how this all played out. Two guys getting drunk, they're roughhousing, right? Who knows what led to what. But it sounds very plausible, given Chris's past behavior, especially when he was drinking. All the stories of how he would just fly into a rage, his eyes would glow, and he would attack people. I can believe this man feared for his life and acted in self-defense. And it sounds very appropriate that alcohol, ultimately, is what did in Chris Adams. David Manning says he'll remember Chris for being great in the ring, but he was also a man that did not want to control his alcoholism. His daughter wishes that he was here to see how his kids turned out, and she thinks that he would be proud of them. It's always the kids that end up being hurt in these stories. So, I mean, just episode after episode over these last however many seasons now it's been, 5 seasons, I guess, of Dark Side of the Ring. So many stories like this. Too many stories of drinking and men making orphans out of their kids and widows out of their wives. It's pathetic. When you live hard, you die hard. And they don't have to suffer the consequences for it because they're dead. They don't care. It's their families. They're the ones who pay for it. But that's the story of Chris Adams. When you live hard, you die hard.